Orchard Human Services, uplifting lives by counseling, educating, and caring. With Dr. Darleen Claire Wodzenski.
Welcome to the Compassion Chronicles. We're here today with Nate Terrell, licensed clinical social worker, someone I met through LinkedIn because he'd written an amazing book called Achieving Self-Compassion, Giving Yourself the Gifts of Happiness and Inner Peace. I bought the book, read it, reached out, and we have become friends over the internet, and we're here having this conversation. Welcome. We're doing this fun video thing. I've never done this before. Have you?
I have not. I've done similar types of things, but nothing exactly like this. And I'm really excited to be here because there's nothing I'd rather talk about than the wonders of self-compassion, particularly somebody like you who shares so many interests and concerns and sensitivities with me.
Yes, self-compassion, and then teaching compassion to others.
Absolutely.
It's
Absolutely.
one of the biggest jobs that I have in my life. It might be the catch-all for everything. Sometimes
Well, I look forward to hearing more about how you do that.
Yeah, I wonder sometimes if everything I do isn't all in the one big bucket called compassion, and it's just all different flavors and textures.
You could do a lot worse than to have the focus of your life be compassion for yourself and compassion for others. That's pretty much it, I think, you know?
Yes. So I know that when I first came to the concept of self-compassion, for me, I processed it as self-love.
Right, right.
But then it matured over the decades as I grew older. Can you share with me the story of how you came, because there's a really cool story about how you decided to write this book.
Yes. Well, I grew up in a Quaker family and became a social worker, not surprisingly. And there was a lot of emphasis put on helping other people, saving the world. And naturally, I put a lot of energy into doing that. I worked for agencies. I was a therapist. And sort of all my friends and family sought me out for help and guidance, as it happens with a lot of therapists. And I never got burned out, but I was never very good at taking care of myself. And then I had an experience with my son about 6 years ago that really changed my life. We adopted him when he was 9, and he came to us having had some trauma from his past. And we went through a lot of ups and downs in our relationship. The problem was I was always hovering around him. Didn't give him enough space. And we were driving in my car near where I live in Mullica Hill, New Jersey. And he looked at me very abruptly and asked me a question that changed my life. He asked me, "You know what I hate the most about your dad?" I mean, come on, what kind of a question is that? And I said, "What's that, buddy?" He said, "You think you can make me happy. You think you can take away all of my pain." I said, "Absolutely. I love you. I'll do anything for you." Without missing a beat, he said, "Well, you can't. That's my responsibility. I need to do that. You're making it worse by trying so hard."
Wow.
I was stunned. For a minute, I was actually speechless, which is unusual for me. And I looked at him and I said, "What should I do?" I really meant it. I wasn't just asking it rhetorically. And he said, "Why don't you take care of yourself for a change?" He said, "You're always hovering around me. You're always trying to rescue everybody." He said, "You act like you're Gandhi or something." I didn't mind the comparison. Of course, I'm not Gandhi. But I thought a lot about what he had said. And I realized he was right. And I had an epiphany, which was this. As I started to treat myself with more self-compassion by being my own best friend, by doing things I loved doing, I backed off from him a little bit. I started setting better boundaries with other people. I think ultimately, I really worked at not feeling responsible for everybody's pain. I'm a highly sensitive person. I've always felt responsible for everybody's pain. I was kind of exhausted inside. But what I found as I became more self-compassionate was that it did not make me self-centered or arrogant or selfish. It filled me with an abundance of peace and happiness and goodwill and abundance that I could pass on to other people. And that has changed my life in so many wonderful ways. It's not an either or. Now, of course, if I'm heading out to the woods or going to do something I love and my son or my family needs me for some other reason, of course, I'm going to take care of the people I love and I'm responsible for. But most of the time, it's not an either or. It's a both and. And I have found since I wrote the book 5 years ago, there's deeper and deeper and deeper levels of self-compassion, because it's not that hard to be self-compassionate if we overdraw our credit card or can't find our car keys. Those are the little things. But it's most important when we're filled with shame, when we make mistakes, when we do things we regret. Of course, I strive to be the best person I can be, but I have found when I really needed it, sometimes the hardest to give it to myself. But it has really changed my life profoundly. So
I remember when I first learned the concept that although I was living a life of service or being helpful, that everybody wasn't my project, that there were only certain people whom I was to help, just as there were only certain people who were to help me. And the first time that awareness came to me, I was in a hospital with my stepfather.
okay.
And he was terminally ill, and we had to go over to a plasmapheresis center in order to have blood taken out and separated, and part of the blood would go back into the other vein, and then we'd bring this little bag to the hospital and they'd hang it on a pole, and he would get that portion of the blood through an IV. Mm-hmm. So all of us in the family had given as much as we could. So one of his coworkers came into the city on a train. It was in New York City in Manhattan. And she gave the blood, she brought the packet over, but she managed to pass out in the process. Mm-hmm. And I remember that I was staying in the hospital with my stepfather, and it was a very arduous ordeal. And my husband had come to visit that evening, and I only got to see him a few evenings a week because nobody could handle my stepfather. He was mentally ill as a result of being overdosed on pain medications while he was in the intensive care unit. Mm-hmm. And so the nurses couldn't calm him down. They'd had to restrain him. But if I stayed in the hospital room, he would be docile and they could handle him. Mm-hmm. So I was so happy to see my husband. We were newlyweds. But here this woman walks in with a little bag to give to the nurse and tells us that she passed out at the blood plasmapheresis center. So I insisted that my husband drive this woman home. And she kept arguing, no, I'm fine. I take the train all the time. I work in Manhattan too. And I was like, no, you just came here to give plasma to a family member and you passed out. My husband will drive you home. And I remember being so sad that night when he took her home. And for days afterwards, that woman kept insisting, and she was almost mad at me. I just wanted to take the train home, and you kept insisting, and I wanted to go get on the subway. And I realized that I had exerted my will over hers, and I really cut my husband and myself off from an experience of being together. We desperately needed to be in each other's company. It was an incredible strain on a new marriage for me to be actually living for a short period of time in this tiny little hospital room in the middle of Manhattan. It was at Cornell Medical School University or something like that. And I realized, wow, I overstepped my boundaries.
Right.
This woman was clearly saying she didn't want this help, and I insisted on giving it. And that was the first time. I was probably about 20 or 21 at the time. I started to realize, wow, I better watch my P's and Q's. There's a certain amount of respect involved in this compassion thing.
Without it, so what was the process within you to solidify that? I mean, did you make a mental note of it? Did you try new behaviors in the future? What was your process of changing after that?
What I noticed was that I thought I was still too immature at that time, because being 20, I was very full of myself, excited about the world, but I started to become aware that my own process wasn't enough to make deeper decisions, and that I had to be sensitive to other people's needs and desires, and to the fact that there might be an order to the universe. And maybe this woman really was okay, and whatever had caused her to pass out, maybe it wasn't a big deal, and it wasn't my job or my responsibility.
That's right. And for many of us in the helping field, I see this with teachers, I see this with nurses, I certainly see this to myself. We really often do overextend ourselves in ways that aren't helpful and aren't useful. I remember when my mom was in a continuing care facility, I'd go in and clean up her room and act like, and she'd say, let me do this. I mean, why are you taking away all my independence? So clearly we never have the right to do anything that's mean or insensitive or overstepping our boundaries. And what I actually find when I'm deeply self-compassionate is it gives me a level of sensitivity, not only in terms of how I respond to myself, but how I respond to other people. That doesn't mean that we can't set our own clear boundaries. And I've gotten a lot better at this since I wrote the book, in terms of not being in situations that aren't healthy for me, in terms of gently confronting people when I need to. But clearly a lot of people feel like, again, they need to choose between being compassionate to themselves and others, but we really can do both, at the same time. What I try to tune into is a deeper place within me that knows what's best for me in any situation, to get out of my head, to get into the moment, to trust an inner knowing, and simply ask myself, is this a good situation? Is this working for you at this time? It's very, very powerful.
In the short time I've known you, I've felt that compassion. Just a few minutes ago, I don't know if you noticed, but you shared compassion, and I actually practice self-compassion. We were both struggling to find an app that would allow us to have this conversation. So we tried Skype, the webcam wasn't working, then we switched over to Zoom, and then you thought, well, maybe we should go try to fix the problem and then come back at another time. But I knew that I'd worked really hard to set this time aside.
Right.
It was really important for me to be here with you. So I said, well, can we just try one more thing? And you were kind enough to let me go to Google and type in how do we turn the webcam on, and then you tried a couple things and then we got it to work. So I want to thank you. And a simple thing like that, like you didn't know it was important to me. You didn't know that I'd gotten up really early this morning and that I cleared my whole schedule so that I would have enough time to do this, invest in this. So I appreciate it. And I am feeling really happy within myself because this is something I wanted to do with you.
Well, that's great. And I wanted to do it as well. I just was keenly aware I didn't want to be wasting your time. And I was a little hard on myself as we were doing it because I was thinking, I should be prepared. I should be better at this. I am so fortunate as a therapist. I teach at Temple as a trainer to pass on these lessons, to pass on this wisdom. The thing I find, though, is people just don't practice these strategies enough. I say to my clients quite often, well, you need to start talking to yourself like your own best friend. And they say, well, how many times should I do it? And I say, half jokingly, well, why don't you start with 1 million and then reassess? I say, imagine you're standing underneath Niagara Falls and the water cascading down over you is your self-love.
That's right. And as it hits you, it bounces off to everybody else.
Well, exactly.
A friend of mine shared that with me probably about 15 years ago. And she was concerned that I was giving too much at the time. And she said, Darleen, it's just like a waterfall. It hits you first and then it bounces off of you. But if you're not standing right in that flow of self-love and self-compassion, it won't bounce off your body to get to everybody else. And so that was a good visual for me.
That's right. We all need a really clear internal sort of thermometer, if that's the best word, or a gauge as to what we need to do at any given moment. Do we need more self-care? I say to myself, do I need to go to the woods? Or there's a beautiful garden near me called Longwood Gardens. Do I need to meditate? Other times, though, I feel like such an abundance. I feel so full. I just want to spread it around. And then maybe I call a friend, or I'm even extra pleasant with the people at the supermarket, or I figure out other ways I can spread my love and care. And it's a back and forth, but I've gotten pretty good at knowing that. And my wife's pretty good too. She says, why don't you go to the woods when I start annoying her in some way with my own angst or whatever. And she senses that in me. But again, people just need to practice these strategies all the time, whether it's their appreciation of good things in our lives, whether it's getting out of our heads and being in the moment, whether it's not projecting our needs onto other people. Self-care, this level of self-compassion that we're talking about today, really needs to be the biggest part of our lives, I think, for it to make an impact. We really need to rewire our brains.
And I wanted to talk with you about it in a specific way for just a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'm a therapist too, and I tend to work with families of children who are suffering from a trauma history. Maybe they've been neglected or abused. They are in foster care or adopted, or some children have neurodevelopmental disorders. So these are families who have more than their share of tough times. Mm-hmm. And there is an interesting thing that happens, because I find that there's a big balancing act that has to happen for me as a human being.
Right.
And I am an older adult. I have 9 grandchildren, so I'm not a young person. Right. And I've had health challenges in my life that honestly have only been a gift to me. Learning how to navigate my health challenges has informed a lot of the practices that I use with the children, especially children with neurodevelopmental disorders. There are some biochemical processes and self-care processes that we use that I wouldn't have if I didn't have to navigate these health challenges.
Right.
So an interesting thing that happens for me is that when I'm loving myself and loving the work that I do, it creates a biochemistry in me that is amazing. And I feel so awesome.
Right.
And at the same time, because I'm working really long hours, one day last week, my first client was at 9, an hour from my house. And I ended up at 10:30, an hour from my house. So I left my house at 8 and got home at 11:30 at night. That's a really long day.
Wow.
And so some people, I get a lot of pressure from friends and family and other therapists saying, oh, well, you're pushing too much, you're not practicing self-care. But the reality was, I had a blast all day. I loved all those clients. And the other part of it was, because I did that, I got to take off some time on Thursday and Friday because I was doing a presentation on Saturday. So one day I got to stay home and work all day because I was presenting at a conference, finishing up my presentation and polishing the notes and the references and whatnot. So working that big long day was a gift to myself 2 ways. One, because of the incredible gift of my own biochemistry that is connected to my giving and my compassion for others. And I enjoyed it. I even had a break in the middle of the day. I took myself out to lunch, and I saw that in your book. You talk about taking yourself on a date, being with yourself. I've been doing that since I'm an adult, like since my 20s. I love it. And then the other part is, by working that really big long day, I had a day off that week that I wouldn't have had. And I'm wondering if you can comment, because sometimes I don't even know what to say to friends and family. And they're like, well, Darleen, you're older and you're not in the best of health and you shouldn't be pushing. But I feel like I did a really good job that day, and I loved my work, and I loved how I felt about the work. And I'm just wondering what you can share with me, either to enlighten me or to give me some ideas to speak to others, or a combination of both.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing to say to other people, I appreciate your concern, but I know myself better than anybody, and you need to trust. And this is kind of what my son was saying to me. You need to trust myself, my own process. I try to be so careful at not giving unsolicited advice. I try to be so careful to ask open-ended questions and to listen very, very deeply and to tune into other people's energy and to figure out what do they need, what their strengths are. And you seem to have a lot of self-awareness. So if you were telling me right now that your dream was to walk to San Francisco and you were packing a lunch to do it, I would say, great. What's going on? Why is that your passion? I would assume you would have figured out if you can do it or not. You know what I'm saying? It's so easy for all of us to sort of doubt each other, and we do it from a caring, loving place.
Right.
But it's our projection on to those people.
So maybe the takeaway from today's conversation, if I'm hearing you, is to trust ourselves and then to trust others.
Exactly.
And move from that place of trust that everyone is qualified and competent and capable of caring for themselves and practicing self-compassion.
Well, that's exactly right. I was someplace recently and there was a woman in a wheelchair trying to get through the door. And I said to her, do you need any help? And she said, no, I'm fine, thank you. Now, I don't want to be paternalistic. That's a small example, but it's so simple to say to somebody, what do you need at this point? What's going on? But to ask ourselves the same question. When I go round and round in my head with a worry or a rumination or anxiety, I simply ask myself, is there anything I can do at this moment? The famous serenity prayer question. And if there is, I do it. If there isn't, I visualize I'm going down through a tunnel of white light into my inner peace. And I say to myself, you know what? You can be in this place of peace and abundance and happiness and joy and still take care of yourself. Still take your medicine and get to your doctor's appointments and wear your seatbelt. And it's interesting you bring up trust, because I think so many of us don't trust ourselves on a deep level to know what we need to do, particularly people that maybe grew up in dysfunctional families or people that were victims of abuse and didn't learn good boundaries. We also don't trust other people. And that's sort of the irony. As much as we need to be loving and compassionate and helpful and supportive to other people, we also need to know when to give them the space.
Yes.
To their own problems.
So giving other people their space and then trusting. And while we're checking in with ourselves, we can ask other people, hey, how are you doing? What is it that you need?
Exactly.
And we can move from that place of knowingness. Well, this is great. I want to thank you so much for engaging in this first conversation. The Chronicles of Compassion. I can't wait to explore more with you.
That's great. Do we need to wrap up for this morning at this point?
I think we do. I think that we can make space to move on to part 2. How's that?
Well, that sounds great. I was just curious about when you work with the kids, how do you know when to step back and sort of trust them to trust themselves and when to intervene? What is your own criteria for that?
Yeah, I think I use my grandma self.
Right.
I think that I have learned how to do something that I refer to, and this is not a clinical thing at all.
Right.
So if I were to try to answer this from a clinical perspective, I don't think I could. But I try to have a sense of what the soul of that person needs. Am I seeing that that person has a competency there? Are they showing me a strength? Am I seeing a place where if I just step back and give them a little bit of space, and in the clinical terminology, I would say I'm trying to scaffold them in their zone of proximal development.
Right.
And if I do that and I step back, do I watch them start to see a new capacity unfold? But if I don't see that, and I sense that this is a place where they're just not there yet, then sometimes I'll just step in. But always, I'm checking with them, almost like my husband loves to use a thermometer when we're baking things in the oven. He's always bringing out this little chart to check the internal temperature. Well, Darleen, the chicken is not done roasting yet because it has to be to whatever temperature is on the little chart, right? So in a way, I think I have this imaginary thermometer where I'm checking with the person to see what is their internal temperature for self-compassion, for self-care. Can they get themselves through this? Or do I see them moving into a place of really fragmenting, breaking down, of being less than when they got there? And then I'll step in, do that part. But over time, my belief is that I will eventually just pull away until there comes a day when I'm there with that person and we can be in a balanced relationship. I give you water, you give me a cup, like back and forth like that, so that we can be completely equal and whole.
That's right. Well, listen, it's wonderful to have this opportunity to connect with somebody who shares so many of my beliefs and my passions. I love your energy. I love your compassion. I love your spirit. And I think the thing I love the most about self-compassion is we can always do it. Obviously, there's so much around us we can't control: the weather, other people. 99% of what goes on around us we can't control. We can always be more self-compassionate. We can always be more loving and compassionate to other people. There's just deeper levels of it. And knowing that gives me a tremendous freedom in my life.
And the thing that I want to say is, we are in some grave times in the world.
Right.
And by practicing self-compassion, we are demonstrating to others how to do it for themselves. And I have this notion that if we all have incredible compassion for ourselves and those who are around us, this is something that will permeate the entire globe and move from person to person until humanity one day begins to act as a body of self-compassion.
It spreads. People feel our peace and they're attracted to us. Or I feel their peace and I'm attracted to them. Absolutely, it spreads.
Well, Nate Terrell, licensed clinical social worker, who wrote the amazing book, Achieving Self-Compassion, Giving Yourself the Gifts of Happiness and Inner Peace. If somebody wants to reach you, how do they do it?
Well, you can buy my book on Amazon.com. My email is nateterrell@verizon.net. And I have a website, www.achievingselfcompassion.com. And I have a newsletter people can sign up for. I have some sample chapters. I have a link to some of the videos I've made and some other information on self-compassion. So I would love to talk with any of you. I also do self-compassion coaching you could sign up for on the website. So anybody who's listening to this who wants to learn more about self-compassion, I would love to be a resource.
Good. And then our website is orchardhumanservices.org. And with your permission, Nate, I'll put on a link to your website, maybe a sample chapter or two, and any other information so people can easily find you. Thank you so much, friend.
That would be fantastic. Thank you very much. Have a
Talk
great
to you
day.
soon.
All right, bye-bye.
Orchard Human Services. Uplifting lives by counseling, educating, and caring. With Dr. Darleen Claire Wodzenski.